Well, good evening. So Tanya has emailed me this. Can I extend a very warm welcome to our legal colleagues this evening? Thank you for coming. Welcome. Welcome all MedChi members as well. To them, I would simply say that, as usual, the minutes of the last meeting are outside. Please have a look at them if you wish. I will sign them off in 2 weeks if there are no objections. Please also sign the sheets for your points. Can I also bring your attention to the MedChi Ball, which is on the 21st of June. Please, there are flyers around. Pick up one if you like. My dear wife is brandishing some as well, so you can pick up one from her as well. We had not received any apologies, so that's it. Now, can I introduce Professor Robert McCorquodale to you, tonight's speaker. He graduated in both law and economics from the University of Sydney and went on to work for a number of years as a lawyer in Sydney and London. After completing his mastership, he became a lecturer and fellow in Cambridge and then associate professor and head of school in the Australian National University. He was appointed in Nottingham in 2000 as Professor of International Law and Human Rights and was head of the School of Law from 2004 to 2007. He's currently on secondment from that as Director of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in London, and he's talking on human rights v. medicine.
Indeed.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be back in Nottingham. In particular, a pleasure to see Bill and Yvonne and some other people who I'm impressed that lawyers have come along. Thank you. And it's the thing I'm going to talk about is, of course, human rights. Is it antagonistic between law and medicine, or is it actually there's some sense to which the two can work together on what can very often appear to be opposite sides otherwise? And of course, the issue of human rights hasn't just begun since the Human Rights Act, which came into force in 2000, but that's heightened the issues, particularly about human rights. And it can also appear to those in the medical field as if lawyers and now patients are much more active in this area. So hopefully I'll be able to explain some of the core themes, the core issues behind it, but also what I hope to do is look at a couple of case studies. How do lawyers and medical people look at these issues, and are there in fact ways in which they can look at them in very much the same way rather than in opposite ways? I should add that I've had a reasonable amount to do at different points with those in the medical field. I helped teach on the Masters of Public Health, which is of course part of the university, but also was on the medical ethics board, I guess it was at one point. And that was always fascinating to see how issues do arise in dealing with patients and how much testing you can do on that. At the same stage, I am aware that medical people aren't always happy about dealing with lawyers. I'm sure none of you have that feeling. But of course, what I do understand is these days, medical experiments are beginning to change. That in fact, in medical laboratories, they're using lawyers rather than rats for experiments. And you've probably heard that's for 3 reasons. With my apologies, Dominic. That's for 3 reasons. The first reason is that simply there are more lawyers than rats. Secondly, that there are times when the medical laboratory people get affectionate towards rats. It doesn't happen with lawyers. And of course, thirdly and finally, there are just some things rats won't do. So having set the scene, let's look at what we mean by human rights. Well, there's a massive debate about what are human rights, and we're not in a philosophy of human rights class, so I won't bore you with the details. But it's been an issue which has gone on for a very long time. In essence, it largely boils down to the issue of human dignity. To what extent are these means to protect human dignity in various forms, various kinds, and to what extent do they apply to everybody or just to some? The view I take is if human rights mean anything, they apply to everybody wherever you are in the world, not just to some. How they are applied may change from the idea of human rights. So that, for example, it might well be that in some countries they will treat women in a particular way, but usually they won't say women don't have rights, but their way of applying the rights may be very different from ours. And in fact, the BMA, you'd be pleased to know, has come up with a definition. The BMA section on its website about human rights states this: human rights in medical practice are rooted in fundamental principles, including respect, dignity, fairness and equality. The BMA has always advocated the highest standards of human rights in healthcare, both for clinicians and patients. And that's quite important because in many ways, human rights therefore aren't completely outside the understanding or the engagement of those in the medical profession, even if you're not always thinking in those terms. But if you're thinking of respect, of human dignity in the workplace of medical and surgical, all those involved in the various forms of caring profession, it's not a big surprise to know that at the heart of a lot of this is respect, dignity, fairness and equality. Now, when I think of a definition of human rights, I tend to look at it from a legal perspective. And in law, there's been a range of documents over the years which put in place some legal definitions and legal understandings. They can be, to some extent, Magna Carta, which, as you probably know, next year is the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And that has a right to a jury trial. Now, of course, in the context of those times, it doesn't quite mean what it does today, but there are a range of rights which have carried through, and of course, the French constitutions, almost every country in the world has some human rights protection, either in their constitution or in legislation. So there must be a sense to which it's understood as being part of what is necessary in a society. And when I look at it from an international human rights perspective, there's a range of international treaties which protect human rights. They range from treaties which are about non-discrimination on the basis of race, to treaties about disabilities, treaties about the protection of children. There's a whole range of these documents. But if that's the context, I have a question for you. I'm afraid this is a relatively interactive start. I'd like you to give me some examples of what you think are human rights. Just one example each would be great, and I'll write it up here. Can anyone start? Can anyone tell me what they think an example of a human right? Free speech, okay. Liberty. Sorry, is that too small? Good luck. Anyone else? Oh, come on, you're going to stop at 2?
Food and water.
Water. Water is a great one, yep. Religion. Come on, keep. Life. Shelter. Healthcare. Good. I'm pleased someone thought of that. Fair trial. Say again. Pay rise. Okay, I'll put it as work, shall I? Justice. Oh, that's an interesting one. Yep. Education. Family. Association. Equality. What was that? Travel. Okay, that might be, I can translate as movement, freedom of movement. We run out? Thought, okay. It's often called conscience. Can't even spell it. Choice. Vote, okay. We've already got life there. Well, I mean, if someone comes up with another one, that's great. But let's start with those. Are there any up there which somebody thinks shouldn't be up there? It's not really a right. That's a great question in terms of what are the obligations that arise from these rights. I'll come back to that in just a moment. It's a very fair question. But the other part of your question is it possible to have a right where there's not, if you like, a remedy, a way in which you can actually operate on it? That's a very, very good question. It's often one of the hardest debates on this, in that how do you actually enable a remedy to occur? At this stage, let's just start with whether these could be human rights and why they are, and then we'll see whether that's... Yes? Okay, can I just hold you there? We're going to get to that point. Absolutely. How do we balance these rights? But is there any rights up here that someone thinks shouldn't be up there as a right? Yes? Okay, good. In fact, I think the way it was expressed was just asked whether or not there's a right to pay. I can just assure you, sadly enough, there's not a right to pay per se. Interestingly enough, there is a right to work. But in fact, what it is a right to safe working conditions. So about safe... it's called right to work, but it's not very well described. But it is, in fact, about, is it a safe working condition? Are you paid for equal work for equal effort? Those kind of things. So pay can come into it, but not just you automatically pay. Exactly. Or what do we define as work? Sure. Interesting enough, it is called a right to work, but it's defined in terms of work conditions, not actually as you would understand it. So that's a very fair comment. Anyone else got ones they don't think should be? We're going to get to that. I'm not going to answer that one yet. Education. Why should education not be a right? Okay, it's not necessary for human respect, dignity, fairness, equality. What do you mean not? Okay. Okay, it's an interesting point. Interestingly enough, it is seen as one of the, in fact, in the European Convention of Human Rights, we have right to education, most of which don't include any of the rights on the right-hand side at all. Well, the way it's protected under most human rights is that you should have a right to free access to primary school, and then it goes further up, the access is more limited. Well, self-defence, actually, I'm going to come to that just in a slightly different way, in that self-defence is a defence to the right to life. If someone is trying to kill you and you kill them in self-defence, that's an exception to the right to life. Okay, I put them in these orders basically because these kind of rights here are called civil and political rights. The rights to enable us to engage with each other, to engage in a political society, to engage in civil society. Things like association, movement, that kind of thing. These on the right-hand side are called economic, social and cultural rights. They're rights which protect our engagement in those kinds of activities. And there are some, such as equality and non-discrimination, which are called cross-cutting rights. You should have equality in each of these things. It's not as if it's only in some. Interesting enough, one you haven't got up here, which some would say happens when you go onto a ward, is this one. Freedom from torture. That's a joke. But freedom from torture is clearly one of the rights very often expressed. Okay. Let's say those are the rights. There are some other rights. For example, there's some collective rights, a right not to have genocide, a right of self-determination. But let's look at the ones we've got there. Oh, the one I didn't actually talk about was freedom of choice. Choice is not actually a human right. It falls within liberty in the sense you shouldn't be forced in a different way, but there's not a right to choice. And part of that is because it may well fall within others rather than as a separate right. Okay, but which one of these, looking at the ones you've got there, which human right is the most important? Okay, why do you say life? Okay, so right to life is absolutely the most important in every person, in every situation. Okay, anyone disagree? Yes? No, not getting that. No, not getting that far yet. Well, there are other rights. Well, then maybe I'll answer it different. Are there other rights which you would say were important, or the most important? Sorry?
Freedom.
Why is freedom the most important?
You can be alive as a slave, or you can be alive in a confined space, imprisoned. I think it's more important to be free than just to be alive.
That's a really good point, both at the philosophical, conceptual idea, but also in the practical. Because, for example, what say you don't have water, or you don't have shelter? You may have life, but for you, that may be the more important right. That yes, you exist, but actually in terms of your infringement of rights, life may not be the most important. So you've got to be slightly careful, maybe beyond life, to think of which for us might be more important, could be different depending on the circumstance. I mean, some of my work around the world has been where actually it can be just simply, it could be labour issues. You can't actually access any work because you don't have an ability to get the movement to get from place to place. Yes?
Isn't there a hierarchy to various rights? After all, if you don't have the right to life, if you don't have life, you aren't going to have any of the others either.
Well, that was the argument down here. But if you, okay, let's say we take life at first. What's the next hierarchy? If you're going to have a hierarchy, what's the next one? Might be for you water. For someone else, water may not be an issue. So I just think it's, even if we begin with life as you know, one of the most important, I don't think we can go any further on a hierarchy because we immediately get into different people's circumstances. Now, the reason I say that is, very often we're going to face people who, for them, that's going to be the particular right which for them is the most important, which may not even feature on your general engagement. But where they're coming from, that's the most important thing for them, which can be very frustrating at times. But it is the reality of people's situations. For them, that's going to be most important. If I can just give an example. If you happen to be in Syria at the moment, there are going to be different kinds of rights which are going to be important for you than if you happen to be living in Madrid. The circumstance will be different. Yep.
But isn't that ultimately bound up in the freedom of thought? So if you have a right to free thought, then that has quite an interesting side. If you whatever your thoughts are, bring it all out in your I have a thought, so I want to die. I have a thought, or in whatever way I want to conduct my life. It's about the thought and respecting other people's thoughts. And I also fundamentally believe that we can all spout out about what our rights are, but we should also, on the back of that, on the flip side of that, have a responsibility.
Sure. Okay, we're going to get to that point in just a second. Let's start with, I mean, if you say thoughts are most important, if you don't have, let's pick one of these other things, if you're being tortured, fine, you might have freedom of thought, but you're being tortured. It's very hard to say that has to be the most important.
But what I mean is it's not, I'm not saying it's the most important, but I'm saying it's a thread that runs through all of the other rights on that.
Well, some would justify that's why you need education, because actually thoughts by themselves sometimes do need a degree of information in order to be able to explore them further. Yep.
Justice.
Yes, what about justice?
Isn't that one of the most our legal support?
Well,
Justice, you have no access to any of the rest if they're denied to you.
I think that's right. If you think of justice in terms of access to a remedy, I think that's a very, very strong argument that have you got a right if you don't have a remedy, which was your earlier point. In conceptual terms, absolutely. Otherwise, you say, if you've got no remedy, you've got no right. You begin automatically to wipe out the vast majority of the world who don't have an access to a remedy. And I think in human rights terms, that's conceptually very difficult to say you don't have the right unless you actually have a remedy. Because if you start with the fact that someone does have a right, then they're being denied a remedy. It changes the nature of the debate. If you say you simply don't have it because we, the government, aren't giving you a remedy, you automatically do away with any sense of any of these kind of issues being at the core of a person's being. Instead, you just say, if we don't give you a remedy, you're never going to have a right. It is a tension, but I think it's quite important for that not to overcome the rest. Yes, if you want to assert your right, fair trial and those kind of things are necessary, but actually the right itself, I think, should be separate from the remedy. Yep. Well, that's exactly where I'm coming to. What's interesting is every single one of these are to some extent in an international document, international treaty which carries obligations. And in many ways, they're often quite vaguely defined. As I look, well, at the moment, I'm going to look at the right to health. But they are nevertheless relatively clearly defined. For example, it'll say you have a right of freedom from torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment and punishment. Now, in the end, we'll have to determine what is an inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. But the statement is very clear. That's a definition of the prohibition on torture. And the interesting thing, there's about 8 major treaties, global treaties, which protect every single one of the rights you've got up there, and some others. If you think about the about 200 countries in the world, which of them do you think hasn't agreed to any of them? United States, North Korea, Iran. I think only 3. Say? Russia? China? 5? 5 out of 200? You think that's the only number of states that haven't agreed to any of these? UK. Yes, UK is, for example, part of the European Convention of Human Rights. Clearly they are. Most Middle East? Okay, that's a vague term. Let's lump in about 12 there. Turkey? Vietnam? Syria? So we've got about 20, let us say, at most there. So let's say 1/10 of all the states in the world have not ratified a single international treaty which says they should comply with this. The answer, incredibly as may seem, is 0. Every single country in the world, every single one, has agreed to at least one major human rights treaty. Now, that's the only fact you go away from here. That's a good fact. I'm not saying they uphold it, because clearly almost no state does. Even if you think of the states, some of the Scandinavian states, no state does. And that's the problem of saying if you don't have a remedy, you don't have a right. But every single one of those states, every single one, agrees, A, there are human rights, and B, they have legal obligations under them. Of course, they, like us, try to get out of it. They say, oh, well, no, this is a different situation. This is an exception. We look at it differently. So we're a long, long way from saying they comply. But it's really important to start that they agree there are human rights and they agree there are legal obligations they should comply with. Okay, the frustration is they don't do that. But it is a very helpful start, I think, when looking at this, because then no government can say, you can't criticise us, when in fact we can criticise them. Not because we don't like what they do, but because they're not complying with what they said they would comply. And that changes it a lot. If you think about, in the medical profession, very often someone will say, I don't like what you do. But if you say, well, actually, this is what, my terms of understanding, this is my contract, this is what I'm meant to do, it changes the discussion. If they begin saying, but you said this, it does change the discussion. And so, amazing though it may seem, every single state has agreed to this, but of course, it's very far point from actually complying with it. But that's still important because you can then look at where they haven't complied. And there's one other point which picks up actually the lady at the top's question. Rights don't exist in a vacuum. Rights exist in communities. So, and this is your point, rights and responsibilities are linked. For example, Bill couldn't just stand up and suddenly shout fire and say, that's my freedom of expression, because all of us are affected. If I had a disease which was very easily communicated to other people, I might be restricted in my freedom of movement. So sometimes rights are limited because of the rights of others or because of the general interest of the community. And that's necessary to remember. And very often, some of the people you deal with will not understand that. They'll assert, I have a right, it means I can do anything. It does not. But it's their language you will hear. I talked to non-government organisations, I talk to governments, I talk to corporations, I talk to a range of different people. And time again, they expect a right is absolute. But rights have limitations. Look at those rights. Are any of those rights absolute? Have no limitations on them at all? None? Not even one? Speech can be limited all the time. I mean, defamation is a limitation on speech. Life. Interesting enough, we've already had an example where life can be infringed. Self-defence. You can actually kill somebody else in self-defence. And arguably in warfare, sometimes life. So interesting enough, life is not unlimited. But there is one up there. Well, oddly enough, that's not up there. You don't have a right to hang. But you do, though, interesting enough, under most human rights treaties, have a right of a death penalty. And so that's a limitation on the right to life. I don't agree with it, but it's how it is. In fact, I helped draft the Malawi Constitution and took out the death penalty. And politically, it wasn't what they were happy to do, so it's still in there. This is torture. That's because you can't torture just a little bit. It's either torture or it's not. And so torture there's no limitation on. But all the other rights can be limited to protect the rights of others or the general interests of the community. So that comes back to your point. When we look at rights, be very careful of assuming that somebody who comes and say, I have a right to, actually there may be many instances where that can be limited. I'm going to look at some of those health examples in just a bit. So just to say those are the different kinds of rights which one can have: civil, political, economic, social, cultural and collective. Collective right being something like freedom from genocide. Most of them are individual. An individual has the right. But some of them are group rights. Things like minority rights might well be a group right. We looked at which are the most important and the concerns there might be about hierarchy of rights. And the interdependence of human rights. I haven't quite mentioned that, but if, for example, there may be a connection between religion and speech. Sometimes they can be in opposition with each other. There can be times when shelter will affect your ability to family and association. So rights are very often interdependent. Okay, international human rights law is, as I say, the main area that I look at. And what I said, just those treaties. They bring binding obligations on governments, legally binding. They can't pretend they don't do them. Sadly enough, a party to the treaty doesn't mean that you comply with it, which countries just look at. What's great about it is it does give a voice to criticise. Because so often if a government's criticised, let's say someone's mentioned China or Russia, they're criticised for human rights, they just say, that's a bilateral argument, you, the UK, are not liking what we do. But if your argument is, well, actually, it's not us, the UK, it's you aren't complying with what you've said you will comply, it changes the nature of the debate. We talked about rich rights, and the limitations, just to summarise, are to protect the rights of others and, of course, the general interests of society. Okay, rights and responsibilities. What about the right to health? This is a great right, because the right to health is a crazy name for a right. Nobody can be healthy. But somehow or other, this is the terminology we use. We use the notion of the right to health, the same way we talked about the right to work. That's the summary of the term. But of course, that's not actually what it's about. So it's called the right to health, but actually it's not about a right to being healthy. So how do we define it? Well, if it's not that, what is it? Primarily, it's about access to health care. That's mainly what it's about. Not solely, as I get to, but mainly what it's about. It's also about environmental health. Let me give you an example. I was in Bosnia-Herzegovina doing some work with the United Nations there. And one of the big difficulties was getting clean water. That's part of environmental health. Occupational health. things of health and safety in terms of workplaces, health and safety in a range of other factors, and finally the provision of health information, which can be really crucial in something. Someone's already mentioned things like maternity care, in early stage, in a language that they can understand. Those are the 4 key elements of the right to health. None of them about being healthy, per se. None of them about you have a right always to perfect health. But they're about the means to enable you to have your dignity in health terms. Now, how they've been defined and clarified in international law is using what's often called the 4 A's. The access to healthcare needs to be available, accessible, acceptable, and appropriate. Now, what's that meant is, firstly, available. They have to be in sufficient quantity. Not just one healthcare unit somewhere far distant from anybody else. They have to be, therefore, accessible and in sufficient quantity for the relevant amount of population that there is. And in the availability, the priority is primary health care. So when we look at access to health care, what's often called the minimum standard or the core elements of it is about primary health care. That should be where most of the resources go into. And I'm going to come to resources in a second. So that's the core element of available. The second element is accessible. And accessible means, yes, of course, in terms of disabled access, but it's accessible in a much broader sense. It's accessible to all of society and not, say, only to some, which happens in a number of countries, or only to certain groups. So it can't be discriminatory in that. And it's accessible in the sense not just to men, not just to women. Have to be acceptable. The drugs have to be ones which haven't expired. The drugs have to be ones which are actually appropriate for that, taking into account cultural issues in some instances, and appropriate. Appropriate, of course, is more in terms of the training of healthcare, that the type of healthcare that's being provided is appropriate in that circumstance. But a key element in all this, and the way it came up in an early question, is all of these are resource intensive. How on earth can you possibly, any country, provide those things to uphold it? And that's a very fair question. And most rights actually require considerable amount of resources. Once again, if we go back to that, the list I've written up there, very often people look at these side of rights, these civil and political rights, and say, well, there's no resource involved in that. Those are really the proper rights. Freedom of thought, you don't need to put anything into it, freedom of religion, fair trial, family. There's no resource involved in that. These are all incredibly resource intensive. So how can you have a human right when you're expecting government to put these things in place? It's not quite that straightforward. Is fair trial free from resource? Why do you say no, Dominic? Great answer. So it's incredibly resource intensive. You think the fight at the moment in the lawyers about appropriate legal aid is just one little part of the issue about actually your access to justice. So it's not as if some rights have no resources and other rights have lots and they're different categories. For example, some of these access to healthcare may not take an awful lot of resources to make sure you're non-discriminatory, to make sure you actually provide health information. May not actually take a lot of resources and may save money. One of the greatest death areas of death can be in relation to maternity health care, often because there's not appropriate information, appropriate hospitals available. But also, one has to be slightly wary sometimes of government statements about they don't have enough resources. I've worked enough in developing countries to know very often if you unplug it a little bit and you search a little bit more, surprisingly they have huge armies. They don't seem to be a problem resourcing their military, but the last place they put resources is healthcare, even though this is an investment, a long-term investment in a society. So yes, they are resource intensive, and one can't pretend that these rights don't take money, but some parts of rights are not particularly resource intensive, and yet there's a great deal of resistance on it. And so, just to take one step further, the BMA produces a toolkit for health professionals called The Right to Health. I'm sure you've all read it in depth. But just it looks at kind of some of these issues and actually how one can look at a lot of the activities you provide anyway in terms of a right to health. That may not be how you're looking at it, but actually it's very often how it works. For example, if you're making a decision as to priority of patients, very often you look at it from a healthcare perspective, not just because you don't like those kind of old patients and you like those young patients. Actually, if you think in rights terms, very often that's actually what's being done. So the toolkit, although it uses the language of the right to health, is not actually far from what happens in the ordinary process of your activity. But it can be a challenge. I mentioned before I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there hospitals, this is not long after the war, some hospitals had the Serbian flag outside. Serbia is a different country, but it's heavily involved in the war. And so somebody who was from Bosnia may not want to go into a hospital with a Serbian flag outside. Is that a denial of their right? Well, no, they go in, they're treated, etc. But actually sometimes the circumstance means somebody does not feel it's accessible. So there can be tricky things. I was meant to go to Botswana last week to talk on issues of climate change, which is relevant for the example of water. Because, for example, this is a report we were doing, what happens if an island disappears? Is somebody a refugee? Our conclusion was no. A refugee is someone persecuted. Who's persecuted them? But that doesn't mean that's the end of the argument. Then there's issues of humanitarianism, which then arise. But what's interesting about Botswana is that they provide all these things to the people in their territory. Seems extraordinary. You kind of think, how can that happen in an African country? That's a priority. It is possible if you choose where your resources go. So that's, if you like, the right to health, which I don't pretend is a right to be healthy. But if you think of sometimes the way you act and the activities you undertake, very often you are consistent with this, albeit not thinking in right to health terms. Having set that out, I'm now going to ask you to think again, I'm sorry. I want to look at some different applications of the right to health, how they operate. I'll give you the first example. We have, go back. Let's say we have an HIV positive pregnant woman who's from some country, let's say in Asia. She doesn't want to be deported. She's in this country. She says, I have a right to health. You shouldn't deport me. She says, the drugs in my country where I'm going to be put back to are not good enough. What do you think? Should she be deported or not?
Why would she be deported if she's broken? I feel that if people have broken the law, then they are perhaps entitled to the same human rights as a
Okay.
liberty or being deported back to their own country.
Okay, let's pick up. That's a bigger issue, but it's a fair issue. When someone, let's say it's somebody who is UK, British national, and has broken the law, do they still have all their human rights?
Not liberty.
Absolutely right. They're denied their right to liberty. Are there any other rights they are denied? Look at those. Are there any other ones they should be denied because they've broken the law?
Well, it sounds like it's very
Okay, they may have visiting a family. They may not be able to propagate or reproduce. You're right. Any others? Aha. Should they not have the right to vote? That is, of course, a debate. I would say it's not a necessary part of being in prison that you can't vote. In fact, I would look at it, if they come out of prison, actually you want them to engage in society and not be removed from society. But that's a personal opinion. But my view is most of these rights to religion, to water, to shelter, to health aren't denied just because you're in prison. But now let's take the next step, which is your point. If you're not British and you've committed a crime, or let's say you've overstayed your visa, which is actually probably more common, does that mean you're denied all these rights? You're denied a fair trial? What do you think? It's a hard one. I would say that's not a necessary barrier, that fair trial should still happen for two reasons. One, because it's a right, but also actually, if the British government is serious about how they deal with these kind of people, it's actually much better that they have a fair trial and you see what happens than it's all just pushed out the door as if it's a military dictatorship. So actually, I would say sometimes it's more important to go through this route than not. But let's assume that it's in the court and she's arguing that she should stay, and the court has to weigh up. Should she be deported or not? Yep.
It should depend. If she had HIV positive status before she came to the country and came with the intention of treatment, then she should be deported. But if she acquired the illness care...
Okay, that's a very fair point, and actually the courts would weigh that up. They'd say, was it something which you came in and maybe didn't declare? Let's say she got it here. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I'm making up the facts. Let's say she was not pregnant when she arrived. She arrived, let's say, I'll give you more facts. Let's say she was a student. She was here on a student visa. During the course of the student visa, she became pregnant and she got HIV. Does that help? Okay, we're getting more facts, and this is just an example. Yep.
This is an economic issue. It's not really a justice issue, because if we had unlimited resources, whoever came to the country, we would offer whatever sustenance they needed. But because we don't have unlimited resources, we are saying that we're going to allocate them on the basis of whether you're a citizen or whether you have a right to them. And whether you in fact incur the responsibility that goes with the right.
Okay, let's pick up one of those points, which is you said because you're a citizen, you have rights. If you're not a citizen, do you have human rights in this country? Why do you say yes?
Because I think she's a vulnerable woman, and she's actually dependent on other people. So if she was about to go into labour, would we deny her healthcare? No, we wouldn't. That would be stupid.
But is that because it's stupid or because she has a human right?
She's a human right.
Okay, so you think anybody in this country, whatever their nationality, the UK has a responsibility to protect their human rights? Okay, next to you say no. You said no to that. Okay, we're not talking about charging. We're talking about, does she have a human right? Okay. Okay, fair. But should she? Should she have the right to it? Should we just say, listen, you're not a national, you don't have human rights?
Well, she's got human rights. They don't have to be provided by the country she's in now. The universal human rights, aren't they? They should be provided wherever she ends up. So is it our responsibility to make sure we have human rights are respected where she goes?
That's a good point. If you say the universal human rights, and let's assume that you're correct, which I think you are, then those rights, do they travel with her, or do they only depend on whether the country in which she is happens to protect them or not?
I think the latter. It depends on where she's going.
The situation you describe actually applies to Dubai and other of the United Arab Emirates. If you are not a citizen, an Emirati, and you develop HIV, you will be deported, male or female. Now, that is because of the prevailing view of the Emiratis themselves. They believe that the country is an Islamic country, and rightly or wrongly, I don't agree with it, but they think that sex before marriage, unwanted pregnancies, and getting yourself HIV positive are in actual fact sinful things. And the woman is sinful in this respect. Now that is their genuine belief.
Okay, let's accept it's their belief.
The point I was going to make
Sorry.
is that they have a right to have their country holy, because that's what they think. They think in terms of their country being in concordance with Islam. Now, you may not
Well, actually, interesting enough, you don't, because United Arab Emirates, like Qatar, like Kuwait, are parties to these treaties. And although that might be, and it is 100%, because I've worked in this area, it is exactly what they believe. In doing that, they are breaching their human rights obligations. Just because it's a genuinely held belief, which we may well understand why it is, doesn't make it unable to be an action contrary to human rights. It may be contrary to human rights. In fact, you could say, example at the moment in the newspapers about female genital mutilation. Some cultures say, well, that's our culture. If you believe in human rights, you say, yes, it's your culture, but actually it's a breach of human rights. And that can be a difficult balance to run. And you're quite right, that she'll be thrown out, but the throwing out may well be a breach of human rights. Yes?
I would say human rights would exist despite nationality where you are. But to what extent it's going to be upheld depends on the society's resources, as previously mentioned, but also the extent to which that individual complies as a member of that society. So you don't have to be a British citizen to have NHS treatment. I'm not a British citizen, I've still got an national insurance number separate. So because I work here, I'm educated here, I'm a member of the society. So as unfair as it may seem, how much you get involved in that society.
Oh, so your rights depend on how you're involved in society. That's a tricky one, yes.
Just looking at the words, pregnancy is a state of normality, that is not illness. Being HIV positive is not an illness. Having a complication from HIV is illness. Based on that, she should be deported and she has no right to help.
Okay, that's a very fair analysis. Can I just come back to this point and then I'll come back to yours? Interestingly enough, the way human rights are defined, and all these treaties say it, it's not about citizenship. This country has an obligation to protect anybody in their jurisdiction, whoever they may be, from wherever they're from. Now, many countries don't. You've given the example of UAE. But if they don't, it's discrimination. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But the extraordinary thing about human rights, it's not citizen-based. And so, for example, let's say the UK say, we don't like anybody from, fucking a random example, Australia. Let's throw them all out. No, dump them all back in the ocean. Careful. That's actually, they could do it, but that's a breach of human rights. And also it's a breach of their international obligations. It's both things. So to come back to your point, in fact, that's the way the courts have tended to go. They've said almost what you're saying, that neither of these things by themselves are enough to prevent deportation. But they do, interesting enough, look at the care which would happen in that other state, as they rightly should. In the same way, one doesn't deport somebody where you know that as soon as you deport them into that country, they're going to be killed. So it's right to look at the other country. But simply having those two factors by themselves are not enough to deport. Yep. Sorry, not enough to prevent deportation.
If a pregnant woman who's HIV positive has a right to be treated by Britain, why don't we have an obligation to treat all the other people in her country who don't have to be in Britain?
Partly because our responsibility to the UK under human rights are for those in our territory or jurisdiction.
I think that's the legal issue. It's slightly different, obviously, because here, in this example, we're exercising jurisdiction. We're going to put her on a plane. And I think the point is that once you do that, once you decide to exercise your jurisdiction in that way, you have to reach a decision as to whether it's proper to do that within the international obligation. So it's different to health tourism where somebody arrives, do you have treatment? That's a different question here. If you're going to put somebody on a plane, you must, under your human rights obligations, look at where you're sending them to. What's interesting is the gradation. This is a health question. But if it was, well, I was just making the point, if it was you were deporting somebody who, on good evidence, would be tortured because they were opponents of the regime to which we were exporting them because of that deportation wouldn't have to claim political asylum.
That's right. And so It may be a different issue as to whether or not government wants to put in development aid for capacity building elsewhere, but that's not a human rights issue. Do you understand the difference? It may be a moral issue, but it's not a rights issue as such. Let me give you another example. Let's say we have a 60-year-old man, severe diabetes, and demands that he have kidney dialysis. He says, I have a right to health, you must treat me. Okay, how do you know whether this is futile? Okay. And so a single doctor looking at him can say, I think it's futile, you're out. Okay, and even then, is that enough? 2 opinions, is that enough? Isn't there a risk of... Okay, let's go further. Yep.
Right, you give us several A's, and it's the appropriateness.
Yes.
It's a really important question because it exercises my brain and muscular constantly.
Of course.
Is it appropriate to be treating people at the end of their life with expensive resource?
I'm sure some of the people here wouldn't necessarily think 60 is the end of life. Let's just move on from that.
Is that, in terms of is it appropriate, is that person going to live for longer as a result of that intervention, or will that intervention benefit other people more appropriately?
That's a great... It's absolutely right. And how do you determine that, the appropriateness?
That's an multiple disciplinary meeting.
Yes, it is. And keep going. But you're on the right track. It's no good just one doctor saying that. It's absolutely crucial there is a pre-existing series of decisions which you've made so that when they come up, you see whether or not they fit that. Because if you don't, if it's simply, this is a large, obese man, we don't want him, he's 60, we don't think he's going to go, he's out, that is a breach of rights. But if you've done exactly what you suggest, in advance, the medical team, the interdisciplinary team, have worked out a particular code for deciding who is treated and who is not, then he does not get treatment.
He has the right to buy the treatment if he can afford it.
That's not a human right. A right to buy is not a human right. He may well have the ability to purchase the treatment, but he certainly doesn't have a right to purchase the treatment. Yep.
There is the area of affordability that you haven't made much of, and particularly with wildly expensive drugs that might extend your life from some remote form of cancer for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and cost a vast amount of money compared with the kidney dialysis.
Affordability is a major one. Is a
in the world can afford everything for everybody in health all at once.
But that's part of the decision which in advance the hospital or whoever decides it has to make. It cannot make it at the point of the patient coming. Because if that's when the decision is being made, there's a real risk of issues of human rights abuse, of discrimination, those kind of things. If in advance they've made a decision, NICE says these ones are not on the NHS, and you've also made a group decision about these are their categories of deciding just a second whether or not somebody can be treated. That is, in my view, an absolute way of approaching this which still protects the right but says in this instance the person can't have that right. Yep.
That's very well for the general principle. These decisions are taken day in, day out.
Sure, and if they're taken day in, day out without any kind of pre-existing means of determining that, there's a real risk they will be found in breach of human rights. There's a South African case right on this point, which says if the doctors, in this case Durban Hospital, had just decided that we don't think that he's going to have much success, that is a breach of human rights. If in advance they've made that decision, it's not.
You don't have to know until you've got that 47
Of course, but you might well have ways of determining whether that patient falls into particular situations or not.
The world is full of people who have proved doctors wrong.
Of course.
I'm one of them.
Yeah, oh, that's even better. Let me pick up your point about affordability. One of the circumstances I was in, there was a huge amount of donation given to a particular country where the donor said, I'd like to set up a cancer hospital. It's a big problem, I've got all this money, put in place a cancer hospital. I was asked to advise, is that consistent with looking from a human rights perspective? And as I think I said to you before, the primary protection should be at primary healthcare level. Is it right to have one big cancer hospital in one centre and then at the cost of having no primary or very little primary healthcare? And my view was actually in the long run it's better to have lots of primary healthcare than one big cancer hospital, because actually it has greater impact on a society in terms of protection than one-off cancer hospitals. But it's not so easy. The donor often wants their name in lights. It's the ex-cancer hospital. But I think sometimes we need to be able to stand up and say, actually, in the long run, that's not protecting as many people as if you actually put in place primary health care. So I guess what I'm saying in this one is I would really encourage, as hospitals do anyway, to make clear their reasons for how they decide whether, in resource-restricted times, how they choose between patients. Let me just give you one, which also, these are all based on real situations, obviously. Co-joined twins. How do we decide? Where in this instance, the court was told that they will not survive together. If they're divided, that's the right word, at least one will die. They might both die. What's the right answer? They feel one is more likely to survive if they're joined. That's the medical evidence.
Well, I think the expertise is around to divide co-joined twins now, and so therefore they have got a right to see if that will work.
Even if it's the cost of one of them dying?
Well, if both would die if you do nothing, then yes.
What do the parents say? We don't want you to touch them. Do we override the parents' interests? You think the parents have the ultimate say? Why? Okay. Do the children have separate rights to the parents? You'd say no. Okay. You'd say yes.
And they do. I mean, they have a right to health, a right to be protected, a right to not be abused.
And she's right in legal terms. They do have separate rights, even if, you're quite right, the parent has a considerable degree of say in what's called the best interests of the child. But they're not the final determinant. Because let's say they're of a particular view which says, common example you face, kind of a blood transfusion. Is that a good enough answer, just because it's a parent's view? Yeah, you're going to say something? Yes. Yeah. Does anyone know what happened? They were divided. The court decided that if one could live, then they should make the decision here. And one did live. But I'm not sure this is a legal argument. I'm not convinced this should go to courts. Sometimes it has to be decided at a medical level, but sometimes the medical people aren't able to make the decision because of, in this case, the resistance of the parents. But in the end, I think it's probably a moral decision made by a judge really than necessarily a legal decision. Sometimes the law and the medicine gets caught up and it goes to a court when it's not really or really shouldn't be a court decision. But sometimes that's what ends up happening. In this instance, as I say, the decision was made that they would divide them. I have one more question, which perhaps relates a bit to the bottom picture. You're brought in as a doctor to a detention centre. Let's just say, for want of a better word, it happens to be called Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib or somewhere you might have heard of. But let's say it's not. Let's say it's a refugee detention centre. You've been asked to come in and check because one of the detainees is complaining that maybe they're passing blood or they've been abused in some ways. And you're a government medical person. What's your role when the prison officers say, "No, he fell down the stairs. Nothing to do with us." Which means? Okay, let's say you medically help. Do you go any further than that?
Say the answer. Would you
Sorry, the question is, you're a medical practitioner being brought into a detention centre where somebody has clearly been injured in some way. They claim they've been beaten up by the guards, that you nevertheless work for the government. The guards say, no, they fell down the stairs. Yeah, you can medically treat them. Do you go any further? Is that as much as you as a medical person? Yes.
Under British law, is the whole lot the same as charges? If you think that the injuries in the child are not compatible with the story, then you've got a right and duty to explore this further.
Interesting enough, that absolutely is correct for child, and that's in terms of social services. It doesn't apply to if this is an adult. This is not the same duty, interestingly enough. Yep.
Surely a doctor can't, unless the medical evidence completely goes against it, a doctor can't determine that's if it's not there.
Yeah, but they do have a duty to cover it.
But should it?
Your answers, guys. Finish out with that.
Sorry, yes, say that again.
Apologies. Surely a doctor who medically trained as he may be cannot determine facts of past if it's not there. So we can't really.
So that's one of the medical skills, is you can see how that injury occurred. You can tell whether the injury occurred from falling down the stairs or being kicked. They may, I suspect, you're skilled enough to work out the difference between them.
I think you would like to do something. It would be like if you think I scan pregnant women, so if I thought one of them was being abused by her husband, I wouldn't just ignore it.
Okay.
There's a duty to operate that. You have to still put suspicion into work.
Interesting enough, you don't necessarily have to report your suspicions. Okay, you will do in 2 years' time. The interesting thing is it's not yet an obligation on doctors. But it's a hard one, because in the end it's a moral issue. Once again, it's certainly at the moment not yet a legal issue, but it will become a legal issue. So what I've hoped to show with these examples is they are tough examples. I can't pretend that they're easy ones, which is why I've chosen them. And they are where law and medicine can often appear to be in conflict, but often they're not as much conflict as it looks. The reality is sometimes in the end, the law is a process and the medical information is the evidence, but it's not always as if they're in conflict, but it can look like that without necessarily being that case. So we move to what then could be a human rights approach to health. Well, the starting point is dignity is put to the centre. It's not about the patient being a passive recipient or just there, it's good charity to look after them. It's because they have a right. Now, that's not always easy to face, but it changes the notion of the individual at the core of the process, not the medical establishment, the medical engagement being at the core. That's crucial, of course, but the individual moves to the centre rather than any treatment just being from good works. And what that means is it does hopefully balance this out, because simply because an individual says, I have a human right, is not the end of the discussion. And it's quite important often in medical terms to be able to say, wait a minute, let's actually look at what you're asserting. We don't have enough resources. These are our reasons of determining where to put the resources. Just because you say I've got a right to access this doesn't automatically mean you do. And so there's often awareness both sides needed on that. But nevertheless, the balance moves from being all about what suits the medical group or the lawyers to the sense in which the individual is at the heart of the process. And also then, it's linked in with that point we talked about the kidney example, but more generally, the decision-making is on clear medical criteria, not just moral wishes, not just because we don't like the person, but having that criteria in advance is crucial for defence in this case. And also, I would say encourage participation. Not always easy, you don't always get the results you want, but encouraging participation hopefully makes all groups involved understand that rights aren't either the full answer or the only answer or an aggressive attack. There are ways forward which is jointly protecting human rights, but also ensuring the medical profession still is able to undertake its work without having this fear of lawyers. And finally, I come back to Jonathan Mann, who you might know. He's one of the main, or was one of the main writers in this area. And what he says, I think, is quite helpful in a way, in that he talks about that both health and human rights are modern approaches to defining and advancing our well-being. And attention to the intersection of health and human rights may provide practical benefits to those engaged in health or human rights work, may reorient thinking about major global health challenges, and may contribute to a broadening of human rights thinking and practice. So I do think that it is possible not to see law and medicine as opposing, but actually working together if there's good understanding of this. And so I would say hopefully in the future there'll be less use of lawyers as experiments.